How many days have you spent just going through the motions? Vince, a 39-year-old landscaper, knew the feeling intimately. For 10 years, his life had been a carefully orchestrated routine. 4:30 a.m. wake-up, coffee, equipment check, then 12 hours of backbreaking labor. He'd come home, eat dinner in front of the TV, tinker in his garage, and then sleep, only to repeat it all again. It was a life built on providing, on ensuring his family didn't want for anything. But somewhere along the line, providing became a substitute for connecting. Vince ran his landscaping business, a sole proprietorship, for 20 years. He had built it from nothing, pushing a mower out of the back of a hatchback. The scars on his hands, the permanent stoop in his back, those were testaments to his dedication. He was providing a life for Maria, his wife of 18 years, and Leo, his 19-year-old son. But that life came at a cost. A cost that had built to $33,500 in debt, $28,500 on maxed credit cards from truck repairs and slow winters, and $5,000 still owed on his work truck. It left him silent on the sidelines. His home, inherited in a working-class suburb, was always half-finished, like his own life. A leaky faucet, peeling paint, constant reminders of what he was an asterisk. He felt like he had failed. He dropped out of college, abandoned dreams of architecture, and settled for the fastest way to responsibility: landscaping. That failure became a heavy weight he carried in every silence, and that silence was killing his family. The breaking point arrived with Leo's threat to drop out of community college. "Why do you even care? All you do is cut grass," Leo had yelled during an argument. The words weren't just an insult, they were an indictment. A summary of everything Vince had feared he'd become: a silent, faceless provider, nothing more. But those words also broke something that had been building inside of him for years. The silence needed to end. His family deserved more than a grass cutter. They deserved to know the story of the man behind the mower. Vince woke at 4:30 a.m., the familiar ache in his lower back a greeting to another day. He swallowed the last of his lukewarm coffee, the mug stained brown from years of use. The air still held the pre-dawn chill as he stepped into the garage, the single bare bulb casting long shadows across his tools. 20 years. 20 years of the same routine, of the same fight to keep his head above water. He ran a calloused hand over the dented hood of his work truck, $5,000 underwater, another constant worry. He checked the oil, the spark plugs, listening to the engine's familiar rumble. It was a ritual, this communion with his equipment, a way to feel in control, even if just for a moment. Before the sun, before the bills, before the silent dinners, the weight of Leo's words from the night before settled heavy on his shoulders. "All you do is cut grass." He pictured Leo's face, the disappointment etched into every line, mirroring his own. The kid was 19, same age Vince was when everything changed. He saw the familiar flicker of rebellion in his eyes, that same youthful impatience. It was the same impatience that led him to drop out of architecture school, his half-finished designs now just old notebooks gathering dust on the top shelf of his closet. Maria, her face tired even in sleep, stirred as he slipped back into the house. "Coffee's ready," she mumbled, her voice still thick with sleep. "Okay." He grabbed his lunch, a soggy sandwich of leftover meatloaf, and slipped out the back door. Routine. His first job was Mrs. Henderson's lawn, a pristine patch of green in a gated community a world away from his own. He pushed the mower in silence, the roar of the engine a temporary escape. Each perfectly trimmed blade was a small act of defiance, a silent scream against the weight of his regrets. But as the sun climbed higher, the silence amplified Leo's accusation. "All you do is cut grass." He thought of his own father, a man who showed love through labor, not words. A man who worked himself to the bone to provide just like him. But what had it gotten them? A family that didn't know each other, a house filled with things but empty of connection. Was that the legacy he wanted to leave for Leo? He paused, the mower idling, the scent of freshly cut grass heavy in the air. It was time to tell a story he was once ashamed of. He arrived at Mrs. Henderson's at 6:30 a.m., same as always. Unloaded his equipment, same as always. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. He checked the oil in the mower, tightened a bolt on the edger. Small rituals, a way to stave off the inevitable thoughts. $26 hour. That's what it all boiled down to. That's what he gave them. He put on his safety glasses, earplugs jammed in tight, and started the engine. The roar filled the air, a temporary shield against the nagging voice in his head. Row after row, he meticulously cut the grass, the smell of fresh-cut lawn filling his nostrils. He could practically hear his father's voice, gruff and pragmatic. A hard day's work is honest work. But was it enough? He thought about Leo again, his face etched with that familiar blend of defiance and hurt. It was time to stop repeating the mistakes of the past. The rest of the day was a blur of lawns and hedges, the same monotonous routine he'd followed for 20 years. He gulped down lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos between jobs, his back aching, hands raw. Each weed pulled, each blade of grass trimmed, was a physical manifestation of the weight he carried. He ate his soggy meatloaf sandwich in the cab of his truck, the radio droning on about traffic and politics, a world away from the silent battlefield in his own home. He was $33,500 in debt. This wasn't the life he imagined for himself or for his family. Around 5:30 p.m., Vince packed up his equipment, fatigue pulling at his eyelids. He glanced at his phone, a dozen missed calls from Maria. He knew what it was about: Leo, always Leo. He briefly considered ignoring them, retreating to his garage, but the image of his son's disappointed face flashed in his mind. The conversation was coming, whether he was ready or not. He owed them that much, at least. The drive home was a slow crawl through rush-hour traffic, the setting sun casting long shadows over the crumbling houses in his neighborhood. He noticed the peeling paint on his own house, the sagging porch, the fence that needed mending, another unpaid job on top of the one that already consumed his life. He pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under his tires. Maria was waiting for him on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of concern and exasperation. "He's packing," she said, her voice tight. "He says he's made up his mind." Vince felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He walked past her and headed straight for Leo's room. He hesitated for a moment outside the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. This was it. No more silence. No more hiding. He took a deep breath and opened the door. "Leo," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and a newfound resolve, "we need to talk." The room was a disaster, clothes strewn across the floor, textbooks piled haphazardly on the desk, a half-eaten bowl of cereal sitting precariously on the windowsill. Leo, his face pale and drawn, was folding clothes and shoving them into a duffel bag. He didn't look up when Vince entered. "What do you think you're doing?" Vince asked, his voice flat, trying to mask the tremor of fear that ran through him. Leo finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and hurt. "What does it look like? I'm leaving." "Leaving for where? What about school?" Vince's shoulders tightened. The familiar tension crept up his neck. "School's a waste of time," Leo spat, throwing a crumpled t-shirt into the bag. "Just like you said it was." The words stung. Vince hadn't meant it that way, not exactly. He'd wanted Leo to be practical, to have a skill, something to fall back on. He didn't want him to struggle the way he had. "I didn't mean it that way. I want you to have more than I did." "More what? More debt. More hours working a job you hate." Leo's voice rose with each word. "More of this." He gestured around the cramped room, the falling-apart house, the unspoken weight of Vince's sacrifices. "Why do you even care? All you do is cut grass." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "All you do is cut grass." He saw his life reflected in his son's eyes, a monotonous cycle of sun-faded green, grease-stained gray, and the endless hum of a lawnmower. He thought of the architectural dreams he'd abandoned, the sketches hidden away in dusty notebooks, the quiet despair that had become his constant companion. He thought of Maria, the romance that had faded into a functional partnership, the missed birthdays and anniversaries, the unspoken regrets. He opened his mouth to retort, to defend himself, to explain the sacrifices he'd made. But the words wouldn't come. He saw the raw pain in Leo's eyes, the desperate plea for something more, something real. And in that moment, something inside him cracked open. The dam he'd built over years of silence and stoicism finally gave way. "You think I wanted this life, Leo?" Vince asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You think I wanted to be just a landscaper?" He paused, the weight of his unspoken dreams pressing down on him. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not a rebellious teenager but a mirror reflecting his own wasted potential. "I wanted to be an architect. I had a scholarship. I was good." He thought of those days 20 years ago. Leo stopped packing, his expression softening slightly. "What happened?" "Your mother happened," Vince said, his gaze softening, a smile touching his lips for a moment before returning to a solemn frown. "You happened. We were young, scared. I did what I thought was right." He looked around the room again. "Maybe I was wrong, but I did it for you, for your mother. I wanted you to have everything I didn't." "I didn't ask you to," Leo said, his voice barely audible. "I know," Vince said, stepping closer to his son. "That's my burden, not yours. But don't throw away your chance, Leo. Don't make the same mistake I did. Please, you don't want this." His eyes welled with unshed tears, a lifetime of bottled-up emotions threatening to spill over. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and years of missed connections. Vince stood there, his shoulders slumped, his calloused hands hanging at his sides, finally vulnerable, finally seen. This was it, the moment of truth. All he could do was wait and hope that his son would finally understand the silent sacrifices of a man who only knew how to cut grass. Vince turned and walked out of Leo's room. Each step was heavy, the weight of years settling deeper into his stooped frame. He didn't go back to the TV, didn't head to the garage. He walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cold under his worn work boots. Maria was at work, always working. He stared at the calendar on the fridge, a mess of appointments and reminders. His life laid bare in color-coded squares. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Leo had learned to write, where they used to have family dinners. Now it was just Vince, alone with his regrets. The $33,500 debt loomed large, a constant reminder of his failures. The truck payments, the maxed-out credit cards, the house in constant disrepair. He had promised Maria a better life, a white picket fence. Instead, she got this, a silent husband and a son on the brink. He ran a hand over his stubbled face, the scar above his eyebrow a familiar reminder of his early days, the mower blade, the near miss. It was just the first of many close calls, he realized. He'd been running from his past for 20 years and it had finally caught up to him. He thought of his secret dream, the drafting table, the floor plans hidden in his notebooks. A life unlived, a potential wasted. "I am done living like this," he whispered. The words were barely audible, but they resonated within him like a thunderclap. He wasn't going to let Leo throw away his future. More importantly, he wasn't going to let his family slip away, not without a fight. He would talk to Maria, really talk to her, not just exchange pleasantries and logistics. He would tell her about the architecture, about the dreams he buried. Maybe it was too late, but he had to try. He stood up, his 5FT11 in frame straightening slightly. The stoop was still there, ingrained after decades of physical labor, but something had shifted. He walked into the garage, the familiar scent of oil and gasoline filling his lungs. He picked up a wrench, the cold steel grounding him. He wouldn't fix the leaky faucet tonight. He would find a way to fix himself. He would tell Maria, "I'm sorry I haven't been the husband you deserved. I'm still here and I'm going to work at this." Then he would finally talk to Leo again. He knew simply telling Leo to stay in school wouldn't work. He'd tried that. Ordering him around had only pushed him further into his girlfriend's arms, away from Vince, away from their family. He needed a different approach, one born from honesty, not from the cold silence he perfected over the years. The landscaper realized he couldn't just tell Leo what to do. He had to show him who he was, who he had been, and why he cared so deeply. That night after Maria had gone to bed, Vince found Leo in the living room, hunched over his laptop, bathed in the screen's blue glow. The silence hung heavy between them, a familiar and unwelcome presence. "Hey," Vince said, his voice raspy from disuse. Leo barely glanced up, his fingers still flying across the keyboard. Can we talk?" Vince asked. Leo sighed, finally turning to face his father. The weariness in his eyes mirrored Vince's own. "About what, Dad? About how I'm ruining my life," he said. The words, laced with bitterness, stung. "No," Vince replied, his gaze steady. "About my life." He sat heavily on the worn couch, the springs groaning in protest. He paused, gathering his thoughts, fighting the urge to retreat back into his comfortable silence. "You think I don't care about what you do?" Vince began, his voice low and gravelly. "You think I just cut grass, and maybe for the last few years that's all I've shown you, but that's not all there is." He looked around the room at the faded wallpaper and the mismatched furniture, reminders of a life built on sacrifice. "I wanted to be an architect," he blurted out. The words felt foreign, as if he were speaking a language he'd forgotten. Leo's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "What, an architect? Since when?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Vince reached for his wallet, his calloused fingers fumbling with the worn leather. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, revealing a detailed sketch of a house, complete with intricate landscaping and a sprawling porch. "I drew this when I was your age," Vince said, his voice barely a whisper. "Back when I thought I was going to change the world." He explained about dropping out of college, about Maria's pregnancy, about the weight of responsibility that had settled on his young shoulders. He talked about the long hours, the backaches, the constant worry about money. He spoke of the small victories, like buying Leo that beat-up Civic, and the quiet pride he felt watching him walk across the graduation stage. "I didn't want you to struggle like I did," Vince confessed, his eyes welling up. "I wanted you to have a better life." But why didn't you ever tell me?" Leo asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why did you just shut down?" Vince looked down at his hands, calloused and worn, a testament to a life of labor. "I was ashamed," he admitted. "Ashamed that I didn't finish school, ashamed that I couldn't give your mom the life she deserved. I thought my actions would speak louder than words. I was wrong." The weight of those unspoken words, those buried dreams, felt lighter now, finally shared. He finally revealed a portion of himself to his son, that a 39-year-old landscaper was just a scared kid wanting to show his love. He wanted to give his family that better life, a white picket fence. Vince watched his son absorb everything, the years of silence finally shattered. He saw the confusion in Leo's eyes, but also a flicker of understanding. He'd planted the seed. Now he had to water it. That night, after Maria had gone to bed, the leaky faucet in the bathroom still dripping, Vince sat alone in the garage, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. The air hung thick with the smell of oil and gasoline. He stared at the cluttered workbench, a monument to countless hours spent fixing things, avoiding things. He picked up a rusted wrench, its handle worn smooth from years of use. It was the same wrench his own father had used, a legacy of fixing, not feeling. It was a language he knew, but one that clearly hadn't translated to his son. The silence had built a wall brick by brick, a wall that almost cost him everything. He thought about Leo's words, "All you do is cut grass." A simple sentence that laid bare the truth of his isolation. It was a tragic epitaph for a life unexamined. He knew what he should do. Tell Leo to buckle down, to think about his future, to not make the same mistake. But the words felt hollow, empty shells of the real emotion churning inside him. He thought about Maria, the easy affection they once shared now replaced by polite nods and separate TV dinners. 18 years. He hadn't spoken to her from the heart in what felt like a decade. He'd been so focused on providing, on keeping the bills paid and the truck running, that he'd forgotten how to be a husband, a father. He was a ghost haunting his own home. Vince closed his eyes. He could still feel the smooth paper of his architectural sketches under his fingers, the thrill of imagining buildings rising from the page. He felt a surge of anger, a cold burn that had been simmering for 20 years. Not at Maria, not at Leo, but at himself. For letting fear and shame dictate his life. For trading dreams for duty, and then building a prison of silence around himself. He had $33,500 in debt, and a son about to make the same choice. Then a different emotion surfaced, something softer, something more vulnerable, hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. He could start by being honest, by being present, by being a father. He stood up, the ache in his lower back a familiar reminder of years of physical labor. He made a promise, not to Maria, not to Leo, but to himself. He would be different. He wouldn't just cut grass. He would build something real, something lasting. He would break down the wall brick by brick and reconnect with the people he loved. It wouldn't be easy. He'd have to fight against years of ingrained habits, against the fear of vulnerability, against the weight of his own regrets. But he had to try, for Leo, for Maria, for the ghost of the architect he once was. He had to finally voice all of the unspoken love and regret. He would start tomorrow. He woke the next morning at 4:30 a.m. as always, but something felt different. The routine was the same, the bitter coffee, the clatter of tools in the truck, the familiar ache in his hands as he gripped the steering wheel. But beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was brewing. He usually drove in silence, lost in calculations of time and money. But today, the radio was on, tuned to an oldie station Maria liked. He even found himself humming along softly to a song from their early days. His first job was Mrs. Henderson's lawn, a sprawling green expanse that usually filled him with dread. But today, he saw it differently. He saw the potential for beauty, the way the sunlight dappled through the oak trees, the vibrant colors of her flower beds. He even took a few extra minutes to trim a rose bush she'd been neglecting, carefully shaping it into a heart. It was a small act, but it felt significant, a tiny gesture of creation in a life defined by repetition. The day wore on, a relentless cycle of mowing, edging, and blowing. The sun beat down on his back, sweat stung his eyes, and his muscles screamed in protest. The old doubts crept in. Was he crazy to think he could change? Was he just a grass cutter, destined to repeat the same mistakes forever? He pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the task at hand, channeling his frustration into the roar of the engine. Lunch was his usual solitary affair, a cold sandwich eaten in the cab of his truck. He thought about calling Maria just to say hello, but the words caught in his throat. He imagined her at the reception desk, her tired smile, her patience with difficult clients. He admired her strength, her unwavering loyalty. But he didn't call. He wasn't ready yet. He needed to find the right words, the right way to express the feelings that had been buried for so long. The afternoon brought more of the same, demanding clients, broken equipment, and the ever-present weight of his debt. He thought about Leo, about the argument they'd had, about the pain in his son's eyes. He knew Leo was struggling, searching for his place in the world, just like he had been at that age. But he also knew the consequences of rash decisions, the slow erosion of dreams, the quiet desperation of a life unfulfilled. He had to reach him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawns, Vince found himself at his last job of the day, the Wilcox residence. As he backed the truck into the driveway, the brake line blew, sending the pedals straight to the floor. This was it. After a long day and no brakes to safely lower his ramp and offload the equipment, he lost it. Why? He bellowed into the empty truck cabin, followed by slamming his fist on the steering wheel 3 times. But as he sat there, his mind reeling at the idea of another credit card to max out, he decided it was time to ask for help. After 20 years, he would ask Maria for a hand. He pulled out his phone and called Maria. His palms were sweaty and his voice cracked when she answered. "Hey, Maria, it's me." He explained about the truck, the broken brake line, the looming repair bill. He expected anger, disappointment, maybe even a sarcastic remark about his inability to manage his finances. But instead, there was only a quiet understanding. "I'll come get you," she said softly. "We'll figure it out." And in that moment, Vince felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone after all. Maybe together they could fix more than just a broken truck. Maybe they could fix a broken family. He called Leo next, but he didn't pick up. So Vince texted his son, "Hey, it's me. I messed up my truck. Be home around 8. Can we talk?" The reply was almost immediate. "Sure, Dad." Vince smiled. This was a start. As he was towed home in silence, he watched the world through the dusty windshield. He saw the houses he'd been mowing for years, the families he barely knew, the lives he'd been too busy to notice. He realized how much he'd missed, how much he'd sacrificed, not just for his family, but for a life that had become a hollow shell. He had been so focused on providing, he'd forgotten how to live. The sun set, casting long shadows across the town, and Vince knew his new life was about to begin. The tow truck dropped Vince off in front of his house, a falling-apart place he'd inherited and never had time to truly fix. Maria's car was already there. He walked inside, the scent of her meatloaf filling the air, a scent that used to be comforting, now just familiar. He found her in the kitchen, already elbow-deep in dishes. "Hey," he said, his voice still rough. Maria turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hey yourself, you okay?" He nodded, but she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped even more than usual. She knew he wasn't okay. She hadn't seen him truly okay in years. "Leo's upstairs. He said he'd wait for you." Vince swallowed hard. "Thanks, Maria." The words felt foreign, awkward, but she smiled a little, a genuine smile, not the polite one she usually wore. He hadn't seen her like that in years either. Vince climbed the stairs, each creak echoing in the silence of the house. He paused outside Leo's room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. It felt like facing a judge, not his son. He knocked softly and Leo's voice called, "Come in." The room was a mess of clothes and textbooks, the air thick with the scent of teenage angst. Leo sat on the bed, avoiding his gaze. Vince sat on the edge of a desk chair. "So, about the truck," he began. Leo cut him off. "Mom told me it's okay, Dad. I know you're working hard." The words surprised Vince. They felt understanding. I don't want you to end up like me, stuck." Leo finally looked up, his eyes mirroring Vince's own hazel eyes. "Stuck how? You have your own business. You're your own boss." Vince ran a calloused hand over his stubble, the white scar above his eyebrow catching the dim light. "Yeah, but at what cost? I dropped out of college, Leo, for you, for your mom. And I never looked back, but I always wondered what if." He hadn't meant to say that, but the words tumbled out, a dam finally breaking. "I wanted to be an architect, Leo. I used to sketch buildings all the time. Now all I sketch is lawn layouts. I didn't want that for you." Leo sat up straighter. "I didn't know that, Dad, about the architect thing." Vince shrugged, embarrassed. "It doesn't matter now, it's just, I don't want you throwing away your shot. This is your chance, not some mistake." Leo was silent for a long moment. "It's not a mistake, Dad. I love Sarah." Vince thought of Maria at 19, pregnant with Leo. He closed his eyes. "I know, but love isn't always enough, Leo. It takes work. It takes commitment." He felt a stab of guilt. How could he talk about commitment when he'd been a ghost in his own marriage for years? "I'm not saying don't love, son, but plan for your future too." The conversation wasn't perfect. It was messy and awkward, but it was honest. For the first time in a long time, they were talking, not just existing in the same space. That night after Leo went to bed, Vince found Maria on the porch. He sat down beside her, the wooden planks creaking under his weight. "Thanks," he said, "for helping with the truck." She nodded. "Any time, Vince." He hesitated, then asked, "Can we talk more, like we used to?" She looked out at the night sky, the stars hidden by the town's glow. "We can try," she said softly. And for the first time in years, Vince felt a genuine sense of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. He thought about the poetry he had started keeping in his truck and knew he had to share it with his wife, his son, and himself. It was time to be vulnerable. Day 12, Vince surprised Maria by bringing her coffee in bed. Not the burnt, bitter coffee he usually gulped down, but a special blend from the fancy store downtown. She was still surprised. He made a small effort to engage her in a conversation about her day at work, listening with genuine interest instead of just nodding absent-mindedly. He brought home flowers, a small bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, and placed them on the kitchen table. Simple gestures, but they spoke volumes. He could see a spark of hope rekindling in her eyes. Day 16, Vince took the afternoon off and showed up at Leo's community college. Leo looked surprised to see him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Vince shrugged. "Just wanted to see where you're spending all your time. Maybe grab some lunch." They walked to a nearby diner, the same diner where Vince had taken Maria after their high school graduation. Vince listened intently as Leo talked about his classes, his friends, his plans. He didn't offer advice, just listened. He didn't judge, just understood. He could see that his son was not throwing his life away, just making a choice. But Vince was also more confident now that his son's choice would be well thought out. Day 21, Vince sat down at the dinner table for the first time in years, not just to eat but to connect. He put his phone away, turned off the TV, and focused on his family. He asked Maria about a book she was reading. He listened to Leo talk about his dreams. He shared a story about a difficult job he'd had that day, making them laugh with his self-deprecating humor. After dinner, he even suggested they play a board game, something they hadn't done since Leo was a kid. The house was filled with laughter, not just silence, and for the first time in a long time, Vince felt like he was finally home. He knew there was still work to be done, but he was no longer silent on the sidelines. He was finally in the game. Day 30, 1 month in. Vince woke before dawn, the usual ache in his back a little less sharp. He didn't head straight for the garage and the familiar roar of his truck engine. Instead, he lingered in the kitchen brewing coffee for Maria. He even packed her a lunch, a simple sandwich and an apple, something he hadn't done since they were newlyweds. As she rushed out the door for her receptionist job, she paused, surprised. "Thanks, Vince," she said, a genuine smile on her face. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. The changes didn't go unnoticed at work, either. Old man Hemmings, one of his most particular clients, actually complimented his work, said the lawn hadn't looked this good in years. Usually, Hemmings only found things to complain about. Even the sky seemed a little brighter, the sun a little warmer. He found himself whistling while he worked, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager pushing that old mower around the neighborhood. He noticed Leo was staying home more too. No more vague excuses about being at his girlfriend's or studying at the library. He was just there. One evening, Vince found him tinkering with the engine of his old Civic, the same one Vince had given him. "Need a hand?" Vince asked, surprising himself. Leo looked up a little wary. "Actually, yeah, this thing's been making a weird noise." They spent the next hour side by side, grease smeared on their hands, talking about spark plugs and carburetors. It wasn't a deep heart-to-heart, but it was something. A connection forged in the language they both understood, fixing things. Later that night, after Maria and Leo were asleep, Vince sat at the kitchen table, a notebook open in front of him. Not the one filled with poems he hid in his truck, but one he'd bought specifically for this. He began to sketch, a rough outline of a house, a dream he had buried for 20 years. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made, the architecture program he'd walked away from, the life he had imagined. He wasn't bitter, not anymore. He realized his life wasn't a failure, just a different kind of building. He de-built a family, a business, a life, brick by slow, steady brick. The debt still loomed, the leaky faucet still dripped, and the peeling paint still needed fixing. Life wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, Vince felt like he was finally living it, not just existing in it. The conversation with Leo had unlocked something deep inside him, a recognition that his silence hadn't protected his family, it had isolated them. It had isolated him. He'd been so busy providing, he'd forgotten how to be present. He grabbed his work-worn phone and texted Maria. "Want to go fishing Sunday morning?" He hit send, then closed his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. The early mornings at the reservoir would be a little less lonely from now on. That Sunday, Vince and Maria were at the reservoir before sunrise, a thermos of coffee between them. It wasn't like their early years, filled with stolen kisses and whispered promises under the moonlight. It was quieter, a comfortable silence punctuated by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. But there was a new kind of peace there, a shared understanding that hadn't been present for years. Vince showed Maria how to cast properly, his calloused hand briefly covering hers, a simple touch that spoke volumes. "Remember that time we came here when we were first dating?" Maria asked. "And I lost your favorite lure," Vince chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "And I blamed you for a week." It was a small moment, a shared memory, but it was a start. Vince kept up the late-night sketching after Maria and Leo were asleep. He found himself drawn to the small details, the way light filtered through a window, the curve of an archway. He remembered his professor's words. Architecture is about more than just building, it's about creating spaces for people to live their lives. He hadn't thought about that in years. He wasn't designing grand structures, just simple homes. But in each line, in each carefully drawn detail, he poured in the love and care he felt for his family. The landscaping business continued, the endless cycle of mowing, edging, and trimming. But even that felt different now. Vince found himself taking a moment to appreciate the vibrant green of a freshly cut lawn, the intricate patterns of a flower bed. He even started talking to some of his clients, asking them about their gardens, their lives. He found that people were more than happy to share their stories, and he, for the first time, was willing to listen. One afternoon, while working in Mrs. Henderson's garden, he noticed her struggling to lift a heavy bag of potting soil. Without a word, he took it from her and effortlessly moved it to where she needed it. "You're a strong young man, Vince," she said, patting his arm. "You remind me of my late husband, always working, always providing." He winced slightly, but Mrs. Henderson didn't notice. As he was leaving, she called out to him, "You know, Vince, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help." He paused, her words sinking in. That night, Vince sat down with Leo, not with anger or demands, but with a newfound vulnerability. He told him about his architectural dreams, about Maria's pregnancy, about the decision he made to drop out of college. He told him about the sacrifices he had made, not as a badge of honor, but as an explanation. "I didn't want you to make the same mistake I did," Vince said, his voice rough with emotion. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe you have to find your own path." Leo listened, his eyes wide with surprise. "Dad," he said softly, "I never knew." Vince shrugged. "I never told you." He also confided in Maria about the financial strain, the maxed-out credit cards from truck repairs and slow winters. He'd always shielded her from the stress, but now he realized that they were a team and teams share burdens. Maria was shocked but understanding. She suggested ways to cut back on expenses, offering to take on extra shifts at work. "We'll get through this," she said, squeezing his hand. "We always do." He watched her and could see that the spark was back in her eyes. Vince started bringing his fishing gear to the lake every Sunday at 4 a.m. Maria had started to join him at least once a month. But sometimes he liked to be there alone with the quiet, the dawn, the slow calm before the world started spinning. This was his quiet time, the place where he could think and breathe and feel the silence. He looked forward to his Sunday mornings at the reservoir, but now his Sunday mornings were sometimes shared. He knew the leaky faucet still dripped and the debt was still a burden, but the weight on his shoulders felt lighter somehow. He wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The following weeks brought a momentum Vince hadn't felt in years. At work, his honesty translated into respect. When a potential client tried to lowball him on a big landscaping job, he didn't cave, didn't silently accept the insult as he would have before. "Look," he said, his voice steady, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what my work is worth and I don't cut corners." The client, taken aback by his confidence, agreed to his price. Leo, still attending community college, started showing more interest in Vince's business. One evening, he came out to the garage as Vince was tinkering with a carburetor. "Hey, Dad," he said, "mind if I watch?" Vince, surprised but pleased, showed him the basics, explaining how the engine worked with a patience he didn't know he possessed. Leo asked thoughtful questions, his youthful curiosity filling the space that had been silent for far too long. Maria, sensing the shift, began packing Vince a lunch every morning, a small gesture that spoke volumes. She'd leave a note tucked inside. "Drive safe, I love you." He'd find them mid-morning, the simple words a warmth against the early sun. One night after dinner, Maria dug out his old architectural sketches, the ones he kept hidden in the attic. "These are amazing, Vince," she said, tracing the lines of a blueprint. "You should do this again." Vince looked at her, a flicker of his old dreams reignited in his hazel eyes. "Maybe someday," he said, a genuine smile gracing his face. The leaky faucet was fixed. The peeling paint still needed attention, but it felt less like a condemnation and more like a project they could tackle together. Vince still woke at 4:30 a.m., but now, instead of dreading the day, he felt a sense of purpose. Not just as a landscaper, but as a husband, a father, a man who was finally present. He was still hauling equipment, still covered in dirt at the end of the day,